welcome to Lislab. A Viking prince said to be Ragnar's son is supposed to have sailed out of the cold north, struck Muslim Spain, passed through the gates of the Mediterranean, and reached places that would have sounded almost unreal in later Scandinavian memory. Yet the closer we move to his own lifetime, the less clearly he appears. Who was Bjorn Ironside really? Was he a real war leader, later magnified by Saga? Was he attached to Ragnar only after the fact? Or does his trail through Francia and the Muslim world reveal something stranger? That Viking history becomes most famous at the exact point where fact, memory, and legend begin to merge. If you enjoy investigations like this, subscribe and tell us in the comments which version of Bjorn feels most convincing by the end. Bjorn Ironside sounds like the kind of figure history should be able to identify cleanly. He is remembered as one of the great Viking names, tied to Ragnar, to raids in Francia, and to a dramatic southern expedition into Al-Andalus and beyond that should leave a strong and unmistakable trail. Instead, when we look for him in the records closest to the 9th century, the image begins to thin out. We can see Viking fleets, we can see campaigns, we can even see a leader named Bjorn or Berno in Frankish sources, but we do not see the fully formed Viking prince later tradition seems to know so well. Bjorn feels famous before he feels secure, and that is where the mystery begins. Then Ragnar makes the problem even harder to solve. Later Scandinavian tradition presents Bjorn as one of Ragnar Lothbrok's sons, part of a family line that seems to explain some of the most famous Viking raids in Europe. It is a powerful story because it turns scattered campaigns into one bloodline and gives the Viking Age a dramatic center. But the closer we get to the events themselves, the less stable that family picture becomes. The sources nearest Bjorn's supposed lifetime do not clearly present him as Ragnar's son, so now the question shifts. We are not only asking whether Bjorn existed, we are asking whether the Bjorn people think they know was constructed inside a later Ragnar tradition. Then the map widens in a way that changes the scale of the whole story. This is not only a Viking tale of England and Francia. Bjorn becomes associated with voyages into Muslim Spain, through the Strait of Gibraltar, and toward North Africa and Italy, into older and wealthier civilizations, with cities, armies, scholars, and rulers very different from the northern world. Viking audiences knew best. For later Scandinavians, that kind of journey would have felt like movement toward the edge of the known world. That is why the legend has such force. A man tied to Ragnar seems to break out of the familiar Viking map and enter a richer and stranger one. But the moment the story reaches those southern worlds, the trail begins to blur. One alternative interpretation begins with a reasonable suspicion about the survival of the evidence itself. Much of our written material for the Viking Age survives through Christian authors who were not trying to preserve the reputations of pagan war leaders, while Scandinavian memory remained oral for generations before it was written down. From that point of view, it is possible that Bjorn was clearer in northern tradition than he now appears in the surviving Latin record. Some argue that modern historians are too quick to distrust later saga material, simply because it reached parchment centuries after the events. Oral cultures can preserve real cause even when names, episodes, and motives shift over time. In that reading, Bjorn was not invented by legend. He was made harder to see by the way evidence survived. A second theory focuses on the southern expedition itself. Arabic and Andalusi sources confirm that Viking raiders entered the Muslim world, while later northern tradition remembers Bjorn as the figure who drove that expansion deeper into the Mediterranean. That overlap encourages the idea that real expeditions survived in more than one stream of memory and were only later folded into the family legend of Ragnar. Some go further and suggest that lost Scandinavian material may once have linked Bjorn to Ragnar more clearly than the surviving record does now. Others argue that Christian chroniclers preserve the shock of the raids, but not the full shape of the men behind them. None of this can be proved, but it does explain why Bjorn's legend feels less like a fantasy and more like a damaged memory that later storytellers tried to rebuild. The strongest mainstream explanation starts with the most solid part of the case. Frankish annals do appear to show a Viking leader called Berno or Bjorn operating in the same region in the later 850s, not as a saga hero, but as a real military and political actor. He appears in connection with fleets, with pressure from Charles the Bald, and with the unstable frontier politics of Viking activity in West Francia. Another near-contemporary source places a Bjorn alongside the Viking leader Sigtrygg in the Sen zone, and connects him to a fortified island base that Frankish rulers struggled to break. This matters because it gives the story a real historical spine. There probably was a Viking leader behind at least part of the Bjorn tradition, but the detail that seems to solve the mystery creates a bigger one. Because these early texts do not call him Ironside, do not call him Ragnar's son, and do not give him the sweeping life story later tradition insists upon. The southern world is also more historical than the legend alone might suggest. Near contemporary Frankish writing records Viking raiders making a long voyage through the straits between Spain and Africa and entering the Rhone region in the year 859 AD. Arabic and Andalusia material also confirms that Viking attacks struck Muslim Iberia, most famously in the raid on Seville in the year 844 AD, when Scandinavian raiders entered a wealthy Islamic polity and triggered a serious response. So one of the most dramatic parts of Bjorn's legend rests on something real. Viking forces truly did move into Muslim Spain and the wider Mediterranean. The edge of the known world was not imaginary. Yet that is exactly where the story becomes harder to control, because the geography is firmer than the biography. The raids are real more securely than the prince who later came to embody them. That is why historians remain careful with the fully developed Bjorn Ironside story. The explicit picture of Bjorn as Ironside and as the son of Lodbrok emerges much more clearly in later medieval writing, especially from the 11th century onward, and then expands further in Icelandic saga tradition in the 13th century. By then, writers were not simply preserving events, they were shaping memory, ancestry, prestige, and political identity into compelling narratives. The most likely result is a fusion of real elements. A real Viking leader in Francia, real southern raids into the Muslim world, inherited famous names, and a powerful genealogy centered on Ragnar were gradually woven together into one heroic life. That does not mean Bjorn was fictional in a simple sense. It means the Bjorn who survived was probably made larger, cleaner, and more dynastic than the man who first stood behind the name. So what emerges is not a clean answer, but a more revealing one. Bjorn Ironside was probably neither a complete invention nor a securely documented prince in the form later tradition presents. The most careful reading is that a real Viking leader stood behind the name, and that his memory became a vessel for much larger stories as the Viking world expanded southward. That is why Bjorn matters so much. He does not merely represent one man. He represents the point where northern memory tried to explain how Viking raiders had suddenly broken into a far wider and more dangerous world. And that may be the deepest reason the mystery still holds. Bjorn stands at the point where Viking history enters powerful literate societies that could record the shock of northern raids, yet not in the way later Scandinavian audiences wanted. He is visible enough to feel real, but never stable enough to stay fixed. Ragnar gives him lineage, the Muslim world gives him scale, the Mediterranean gives him wonder. But the deeper we follow him into those southern worlds, the more the story stops looking like a biography and starts looking like history and epic memory woven together. Bjorn Ironside remains compelling because he seems to stand exactly where the known world widens and the man at the center begins to disappear. Do you think Bjorn Ironside was a real Viking leader, later absorbed into Ragnar's family legend, or was the legend shaping him from the beginning? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed the investigation, like the video and subscribe to ListLab.